In the heart of a bustling small town, the Willow's table was alive with energy. Known for its cozy atmosphere and freshly prepared dishes, the restaurant had become a community favorite, a place where families celebrated milestones and friends gathered to unwind. It was a sunny afternoon when James Porter, a retired Marine with a lifetime of stories etched into his lined face, stepped into the restaurant. At 70 years old, James carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had served his country through 2 tours in Vietnam. On this particular day, as on many others, he wore his signature red MAGA hat, a simple accessory that held personal meaning for him, a nod to his beliefs and the values he cherished. The clinking of glasses and hum of conversation filled the air as James approached the hostess stand. But his presence didn't go unnoticed by Caleb Barnes, the restaurant manager. Caleb's expression soured as his gaze locked onto James's hat, the bright red emblem stirring a visceral reaction within him. Known for his outspoken stance on maintaining what he called an inclusive environment, Caleb immediately felt the hat clashed with the ethos he sought to uphold. Without hesitation, Caleb approached James, his tone sharp and unwelcoming. "Sir, we have a policy against political attire," he stated curtly. "I'm afraid I can't serve you while you're wearing that." James blinked in surprise, his calm demeanor unshaken but his pride quietly bruised. "This hat isn't meant to cause trouble," he explained softly. "It's a symbol of my beliefs, nothing more." But Caleb was resolute. "You'll have to leave," he said, his voice unwavering. Hurt but refusing to escalate the situation, James nodded, turned, and walked out the door. The murmurs among the patrons grew louder as the veteran exited, some exchanging uncomfortable glances, while others simply looked away. What Caleb didn't realize, however, was that James's son, Ethan Porter, was no ordinary man. A prominent social media influencer with millions of followers, Ethan was known for his fiery passion for justice and unyielding loyalty to his family. The events that would follow, an internet storm, public outcry, and the eventual unraveling of the Willow's table, would teach everyone involved a profound lesson about respect, humility, and the power of standing up for what's right. Before we dive into this gripping story of dignity, redemption, and the ripple effects of our actions, take a moment to reflect. Should a symbol, no matter how divisive, be grounds for denying someone service? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more compelling tales that challenge perceptions and inspire change. James Porter had always been a man of principle, guided by a sense of duty and honor instilled during his early years. Born in a small town in the Midwest, he grew up with a strong work ethic and a deep respect for his country. His parents, a hardworking factory worker and a dedicated schoolteacher, had always emphasized the importance of giving back to the community. At the age of 18, he enlisted in the Marines, embarking on a journey that would shape him into the steadfast, humble man his community respected. Serving 2 tours in Vietnam, James witnessed the harsh realities of war firsthand. From grueling marches through dense jungles to the tense camaraderie forged in the heat of battle, his experiences left indelible marks on his character. Though he faced loss and hardship, James carried those memories with grace, using them to fuel his acts of kindness and leadership back home. His service earned him several commendations, but what he valued most were the friendships and bonds he formed with his fellow soldiers. Those bonds stayed with him long after he hung up his uniform. After retiring from the military, James turned his focus to supporting fellow veterans and contributing to his community. Whether it was organizing fundraisers for local veterans groups, lobbying for better healthcare benefits, or mentoring young men and women considering military service, James's actions spoke louder than words. He became a well-known figure in his community, often called upon to give speeches on Veterans Day or to lead initiatives to support returning soldiers. In his personal life, James was equally devoted. He was a loving husband to his wife and a doting father to his children, who had grown into successful adults. James found solace in family traditions, such as Sunday dinners and fishing trips with his grandchildren, which brought him immense joy. Even as his hair turned gray and his steps slowed, he remained a symbol of strength and resilience in the eyes of those who knew him. Having recently moved to the quaint town where the Willow's table was located, James looked forward to enjoying his retirement in peace. The small-town charm and friendly faces reminded him of his childhood, and he quickly became a familiar figure at local events and gatherings. From attending town hall meetings to volunteering at the local library's literacy program, James's presence was felt across the community. His polite demeanor and warm smile made him approachable, and he often struck up conversations with strangers, sharing his stories and life lessons. It was during one of his routine outings that the events at the Willow's table unfolded. Dressed in a crisp button-up shirt and his signature red MAGA hat, James entered the restaurant that afternoon with no intention other than to enjoy a quiet meal. The hat, a sentimental piece of his wardrobe, represented more than politics to him. It was a reminder of the ideals he held dear: freedom, hard work, and resilience. James was well aware of the polarized views surrounding the hat, but to him, it was simply an expression of who he was. The restaurant was bustling with lunchtime patrons, the aroma of freshly baked bread and roasted chicken filling the air. James smiled politely at the hostess, who guided him toward a table near the window. As he settled into his seat, the soft chatter of diners and the clinking of utensils created a comforting backdrop. James took a moment to appreciate the atmosphere, recalling how such simple outings had become a cherished part of his new routine. But the tranquility was short-lived. Caleb Barnes, the restaurant's manager, had been observing James from the moment he walked in. Known for his assertive personality and strong opinions, Caleb prided himself on fostering an inclusive environment at the Willow's table. To him, the sight of the MAGA hat was a direct contradiction to that vision. It wasn't the first time Caleb had taken issue with politically charged attire, but he felt particularly compelled to act in this instance. Driven by his own biases and assumptions, Caleb approached James with a sense of urgency. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we have a policy against political attire," Caleb announced, his tone leaving little room for discussion. James looked up, his weathered face calm but questioning. "I'm not here to make a statement," he replied evenly. "I'm just here for a meal." Caleb's expression hardened. "That hat makes some of our patrons uncomfortable. I'll have to ask you to remove it or leave." The patrons seated nearby began to take notice, their murmurs growing louder. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others seemed to silently approve of Caleb's stance. James remained composed, his voice steady as he responded. "This hat is a part of who I am. I've served this country to defend everyone's freedoms, including yours." But Caleb was unwavering. "I'm sorry, sir, but those are the rules." Feeling the weight of the confrontation and not wanting to create a scene, James nodded quietly. He stood, adjusted his hat, and walked out of the restaurant with his dignity intact. As he left, a few patrons expressed their discomfort with hushed comments, while others remained silent, unwilling to intervene. Among the silent onlookers was a young couple who exchanged a worried glance, debating whether they should say something, but ultimately choosing not to. Outside, James paused for a moment on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The encounter had been brief, but deeply disheartening. As someone who had fought for the principles of freedom and respect, being judged so quickly left a bitter taste in his mouth. Yet, he resolved not to let the incident dampen his spirit. He adjusted his jacket, looked toward the horizon, and began the short walk back to his home, unaware that this small act of exclusion would spark a series of events that would resonate far beyond the town's borders. Inside the Willow's table, the atmosphere was noticeably tense. Caleb returned to his duties, satisfied that he had upheld the restaurant's values, but some of the diners exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers spread across the room, ranging from support for Caleb's decision to quiet disapproval of how James had been treated. One patron, an elderly woman, seated with her daughter, murmured, "That man didn't deserve that. You can disagree with someone without humiliating them." Her daughter shrugged but seemed lost in thought, staring at the empty doorway where James had exited. In a corner booth, a teenager surreptitiously took a picture of Caleb addressing James, already drafting a post for social media. "Just witnessed something wild at the Willow's table," the caption would read, setting the stage for the firestorm that was about to erupt. The next evening, James sat at the head of his modest dining table, the faint clinking of silverware filling the room as his wife Margaret set down a steaming dish of chicken and vegetables. Their son, Ethan Porter, a dynamic young man in his early 30s, sat across from him, tapping away on his phone. Ethan, a well-known social media influencer with millions of followers, often juggled his online advocacy work and visits home. Tonight, though, he had made time to share a family dinner. "Ethan, put that down," Margaret chided gently as she took her seat. "It's not often we all sit down together." Ethan grinned sheepishly, sliding his phone into his pocket. "All right, Mom. Sorry." He turned to his father, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. "So, Dad, how was your day?" James hesitated, cutting into his meal with deliberate slowness. "It was fine," he said, his tone clipped. Margaret's brow furrowed as she glanced at her husband. She knew him too well to let the matter rest. James, she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. Something happened, didn't it? He sighed deeply, setting down his fork. I don't want to make a big deal out of it, he began, but Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. Come on, Dad, Ethan urged. What is it? Did someone say something? James hesitated, then recounted the events at the Willows table. His voice was steady, but the pain of the experience was evident in his eyes. Margaret's expression darkened as she listened, and Ethan's jaw tightened with every word. He told you to leave because of your hat? Ethan's voice was incredulous, a mix of disbelief and anger. That's ridiculous. You weren't causing trouble or bothering anyone. James nodded slowly. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't hear it, said it made people uncomfortable. Margaret shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. That's just wrong, she murmured. You've done so much for this country, and that's how they treat you? Ethan, however, was less restrained. This is unacceptable, he said, his voice rising. Dad, you shouldn't just let this slide. James raised a hand, signaling for calm. Ethan, it's not worth getting worked up over. I've faced worse in my life. This is nothing. But Ethan was unconvinced. It's not nothing, he argued. It's about respect. They humiliated you over a hat, and that's not okay. People need to know this kind of behavior isn't acceptable. Margaret reached for her son's hand, her tone soothing. Ethan, your father's right. He's dealt with bigger battles than this. Sometimes it's better to let things go. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. That might work for you, but it doesn't work for me, he muttered. You shouldn't have to keep quiet just because it's easier. James's gaze softened as he looked at his son. Son, life's too short to hold on to every slight. People are going to judge you for all sorts of reasons. You have to choose which battles are worth fighting. Margaret offered a small smile, hoping to ease the tension in the room. Ethan, let's not let this ruin dinner. Your father's been through enough, and we're here together now. That's what matters. Though Ethan nodded, the frustration was still visible in his eyes. He respected his father deeply, but he struggled to understand how a man who had given so much could accept such treatment with quiet dignity. Ethan's nature didn't allow him to let things go easily, especially when they involved injustice. Margaret shifted the conversation, asking Ethan about his latest projects. He obliged, describing his upcoming plans with passion, though his mind continued to dwell on what his father had shared. As dinner came to an end, Ethan helped his mother clear the dishes while James retired to his favorite armchair with the newspaper. The living room, bathed in the warm glow of a table lamp, exuded the comforting tranquility of a family home. But Ethan's thoughts churned restlessly. Before leaving, Ethan sat next to his father for a moment, breaking the companionable silence. Dad, I know you want to let this go, but I can't promise I won't do something about it. I can't sit back and let this kind of thing happen. James looked at his son, a mixture of pride and concern in his eyes. Just promise me one thing, Ethan. Whatever you do, make sure it's done with respect and purpose. Don't let anger guide your actions. Ethan nodded, gripping his father's shoulder lightly before saying goodnight. As he drove back to his apartment, his mind raced with ideas. He had no intention of breaking his promise, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of injustice. The incident might have ended for his father, but for Ethan, it was only the beginning. The morning after his dinner with his parents, Ethan woke up early, his mind still preoccupied with the events his father had described. As sunlight streamed through the curtains of his apartment, he sat at his desk, laptop open, scrolling through old photos of his father. Images of James in his Marine uniform, standing proudly with his unit or holding a folded flag at a community event, filled Ethan with a renewed sense of purpose. His father's quiet dignity, even in the face of humiliation, inspired Ethan to act. Ethan knew his father's story needed to be heard, but he also understood the importance of striking the right tone. He began recording a video, his voice calm yet passionate as he recounted the incident. My dad, a 70-year-old Marine veteran who served 2 tours in Vietnam, was turned away from a local restaurant yesterday for wearing a hat. Not because he was causing trouble, but because someone decided his hat made them uncomfortable. He paused, holding up a photo of his father in uniform. This is the man they disrespected, a man who spent his life defending the freedoms we all take for granted. And yet, he was humiliated over something as simple as a piece of clothing. Ethan's tone grew more impassioned as he continued. This isn't just about my dad, it's about every veteran, every individual who's ever been treated unfairly for expressing their beliefs. We're better than this, and it's time we start acting like it. He ended the video with a direct call to action. If you believe in respect, if you believe in treating people with dignity, Share this. Let's make sure this kind of behavior doesn't go unnoticed. After editing the footage, Ethan uploaded the video to his social media platforms, tagging it with hashtags like Respect Veterans and Stand for Freedom. Within hours, the video began to gain traction. Comments poured in, ranging from supportive messages to outrage at the restaurant's actions. "This is unacceptable," one user wrote. "How can we let this happen to someone who's done so much for our country?" Another added, "Thank you, Ethan, for speaking out. Your dad deserves better." By midday, the video had gone viral, amassing millions of views. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting clips of Ethan's video alongside images of James. The hashtags trended nationwide, sparking heated discussions online about the balance between personal expression and inclusivity. Ethan found himself fielding interview requests from reporters eager to amplify his father's story. Meanwhile, the public's reaction to the video was immediate and visceral. The Willows Table found itself at the center of a firestorm. Negative reviews flooded its social media pages and business profiles. "I can't support a place that disrespects our veterans," one reviewer wrote. Another commented, "This restaurant doesn't deserve my money." The once bustling eatery began to see cancellations, and the lunchtime crowd dwindled to a trickle. Inside the restaurant, Caleb Barnes was overwhelmed. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, each one another blow to the establishment's reputation. Employees whispered, nervously among themselves, unsure of what might happen next. The atmosphere was tense, the usual camaraderie replaced by a palpable sense of unease. Amanda, one of the servers, hesitated before approaching Caleb. "Caleb, have you seen this?" she asked, showing him Ethan's video on her phone. Caleb scowled, his frustration evident. "Of course I've seen it," he snapped. "People are overreacting. We have a right to enforce our policies." Amanda bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think this is just about the policy. People are upset because they think we disrespected a veteran. Maybe we should address it?" But Caleb waved her off. "We don't need to justify ourselves to the internet. This will blow over." Despite Caleb's confidence, the backlash only intensified. Former employees began to come forward, sharing their experiences working under Caleb. One ex-server posted anonymously, "I'm not surprised this happened. Caleb always pushed his own opinions onto the staff and treated anyone who disagreed like they were the problem." Another added, "The restaurant might look nice on the outside, but working there was a nightmare. Toxic management, plain and simple." The negative press emboldened others to speak out, including a patron who recalled a similar incident. "I remember Caleb giving another customer a hard time for wearing a shirt with a slogan he didn't like. This isn't the first time he's let his biases affect how he runs the place." As these stories spread, the narrative surrounding the Willows Table shifted from a single incident to a broader critique of Caleb's management style. The restaurant, once a beloved community hub, became a symbol of intolerance and poor leadership. The staff, too, began to show signs of rebellion. Amanda and a few others confided in one another about their frustrations, contemplating whether they should speak out more publicly or even quit. Adding to the tension, a well-known local activist named Sarah Palmer chimed in on the controversy with a pointed social media post. "This isn't just about one man or one hat. It's about creating spaces that respect and value every individual. What happened to James Porter is a symptom of a much larger issue, and it's time for businesses to take a hard look at their values." Sarah's comments drew further attention to the issue, bringing even more media coverage and public scrutiny. The restaurant's reputation spiraled further when an investigative article highlighted Caleb's pattern of confrontational behavior, citing multiple accounts from employees and customers alike. The piece painted a damning picture of a toxic work environment, with quotes from former staff about high turnover rates and Caleb's rigid control over daily operations. One former manager revealed, "We tried to implement changes to make the workplace more inclusive, but Caleb dismissed every suggestion as unnecessary or disruptive. He'd say, 'If you don't like it, you can leave.' And many of us did." These revelations added fuel to the growing firestorm, with calls for boycotts and protests outside the restaurant. Caleb found himself increasingly isolated, even among his remaining staff. The employees who stayed began to question their loyalty, many of them feeling complicit in the establishment's downfall. The tipping point came when a former employee, Emily Hayes, decided to share her story publicly. In an emotional video posted online, she recounted her experiences working at the Willows Table. "I stayed quiet for too long," Emily admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "But after seeing what happened to Mr. Porter, I can't stay silent anymore." Caleb created an environment where it was impossible to speak up, and that's why so many of us left. It's not just about one mistake, it's about a culture of disrespect that starts at the top. Emily's video went viral, adding another layer of complexity to the narrative. Her words resonated with viewers, many of whom praised her bravery for coming forward. The backlash against Caleb and the Willows table reached a fever pitch, leaving the restaurant on the brink of collapse. The once vibrant dining room now sat mostly empty, the chatter of customers replaced by an eerie silence. As the dust settled on another tumultuous day, Caleb sat alone in his office, staring at the growing pile of complaints and resignation letters. For the first time, the gravity of the situation truly began to sink in. But any thoughts of making amends would have to wait. For now, the storm was far from over. As the backlash against the Willows table reached its peak, Caleb Barnes reluctantly stepped into the public eye. The once confident restaurant manager now faced a mounting crisis that threatened not just his business, but his reputation. With no other options, Caleb decided to issue a public apology. Sitting in his office, he drafted a carefully worded statement, reading it over multiple times before posting it on the restaurant's social media accounts. The apology read, "We sincerely regret the incident involving Mr. James Porter. Our intent has always been to create an inclusive environment for all patrons, and we acknowledge that our actions failed to reflect this mission. We apologize to Mr. Member Porter and anyone else who was hurt by this situation. We are committed to learning from this experience and making the necessary changes to ensure our establishment remains welcoming to everyone." The response to the post was swift, but not in the way Caleb had hoped. Many viewed the apology as insincere, a transparent attempt to stem the tide of public outrage. Comments poured in. "Too little, too late," wrote one user. "This is damage control, not accountability." Another replied. The apology, instead of quelling the storm, seemed to fuel it further. The likes, shares, and angry reactions multiplied as social media users picked apart the language of the apology, accusing Caleb of trying to save face without genuinely addressing the issue. Within days, news outlets dissected Caleb's statement, juxtaposing it against the growing number of testimonies from former employees and patrons who had experienced or witnessed his confrontational behavior. "This isn't about one mistake," a local columnist wrote. "It's about a pattern of arrogance and poor leadership that finally caught up with him." Editorials and opinion pieces delved into the broader implications of bias and prejudice in small businesses, using the Willows table as a case study in what not to do. The restaurant's business continued to decline sharply. Regular customers canceled reservations, and the once busy dining room now sat nearly empty during peak hours. Suppliers began to hesitate in renewing their contracts, wary of being associated with the controversy. Caleb watched helplessly as the restaurant's finances spiraled out of control. Staff hours were slashed, and the already strained morale among employees worsened. Amanda, one of the last servers to remain, confided to a coworker, "I'm only here because I can't afford to quit yet, but I don't think this place is going to last much longer." The few remaining staff members avoided Caleb whenever possible, their frustration evident in their terse exchanges and distant attitudes. Outside the restaurant, the protests continued. Local veterans groups organized peaceful demonstrations, holding signs that read, "Respect our veterans," and "Honor their sacrifices." The events garnered significant media coverage, adding to the growing narrative that the Willows table had become a cautionary tale of what happens when personal biases are allowed to dictate business practices. Video clips of veterans speaking passionately about James's service and the lack of respect shown to him went viral, further amplifying the outrage. Meanwhile, Caleb's personal life began to unravel. Friends distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the scrutiny surrounding him. His family expressed disappointment, with his younger brother telling him bluntly, "You messed up, Caleb. Big time, and the worst part is you're still acting like it's not your fault." The words stung, but they also planted a seed of introspection that Caleb couldn't ignore. He began to isolate himself, finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the confident facade he had once so easily projected. The effects of the scandal extended beyond Caleb's personal relationships. His professional network crumbled as peers and colleagues withdrew their support, unwilling to be associated with the growing controversy. Invitations to industry events ceased, and opportunities for partnerships disappeared. Caleb's reputation, once bolstered by his restaurant's success, had become a liability. One evening, Caleb sat alone in the dimly lit restaurant office, scrolling through the endless stream of negative comments and articles. A particular comment on Ethan Porter's video caught his attention. "Do you even know what this man has been through? Do you know what he's sacrificed for this country?" The question struck a nerve. Caleb realized that, in his heated confrontation with James, he had failed to consider the man behind the hat. Determined to learn more, Caleb began researching James Porter. He started with local news articles, which painted a vivid picture of James's contributions to the community. Photos showed James at veterans events, shaking hands with young cadets, organizing fundraisers, and speaking humbly at ceremonies. Caleb's initial curiosity deepened as he uncovered more about James's life. A detailed profile in a local newspaper provided a comprehensive look at James's military career. It described his 2 tours in Vietnam, his leadership under fire, and the commendations he received for acts of bravery. The article also detailed the challenges James faced upon returning home, coping with the loss of comrades, navigating physical and emotional scars, and dedicating himself to supporting fellow veterans. Caleb leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the gravity of James's story. This wasn't just a man in a hat. This was a hero who had endured unimaginable hardships and still found ways to give back to his community. Caleb's chest tightened as he remembered the quiet dignity with which James had left the restaurant that day. He had dismissed this man over a piece of clothing, failing to see the person beneath. For the first time, Caleb felt a deep, unshakable regret, not for the business losses or the public backlash, but for the pain he had caused James. The image of James walking away with his head held high replayed in his mind, now accompanied by a profound sense of shame. That night, Caleb stayed late in his office, poring over more articles and videos about James. The accounts of James's resilience and humility were humbling. Caleb's excuses and justifications for his actions began to crumble under the weight of these stories. By the time he closed his laptop, one thought dominated his mind. He needed to make amends. Not to salvage his reputation or business, but to honor the man he had wronged. Caleb knew that an apology would require more than words. It would demand genuine accountability and a willingness to change. For now, though, Caleb wasn't ready. He resolved to take the time to reflect on his actions and prepare for the difficult conversation ahead. For the first time in weeks, Caleb felt a glimmer of purpose. Not to rebuild his restaurant, but to confront the man he had become and take the first steps toward redemption. Several weeks after the incident that had set his life into a tailspin, Caleb Barnes found himself parked outside a modest home on a quiet street. The house, surrounded by a neatly trimmed lawn and a few flower beds, exuded a sense of warmth and simplicity. Caleb took a deep breath, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. He had spent days preparing for this moment, rehearsing what he would say and imagining how it might unfold. Yet, now that he was here, uncertainty gnawed at him. Caleb had reached out to Ethan Porter through a mutual acquaintance to arrange this meeting. Ethan, though initially wary, agreed after Caleb expressed genuine remorse and a desire to apologize face-to-face. Caleb had been surprised by how protective Ethan was of his father, insisting on vetting Caleb's intentions before granting him the address. Their brief conversation had been tense, with Ethan's blunt words still echoing in Caleb's mind. "If this is just about saving face, don't bother. My dad deserves better than that." Now sitting in his car, Caleb felt the weight of his actions more acutely than ever. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, replaying his prepared words over and over. Finally, he forced himself to step out and approach the door. Before he could knock, it opened, and there stood James Porter, his posture straight and his expression unreadable. "Mr. Barnes," James said evenly, his eyes meeting Caleb's. "Come on in." Caleb nodded, his throat dry as he followed James into the living room. The space was cozy and filled with mementos, photos of family, framed medals, and a folded American flag in a glass case on the mantel. Each item seemed to tell a story, and Caleb couldn't help but feel even smaller in the presence of such a life well lived. His gaze lingered on a black and white photo of a younger James in uniform, standing with his comrades in what looked like a distant battlefield. James gestured to a chair, and Caleb sat down, clasping his hands together. "Mr. Porter," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to, but I needed to come here in person." James leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but guarded. "I'm listening," he said simply. Caleb took a deep breath and launched into the apology he had been rehearsing. "I want to start by saying I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you that day. I made assumptions about you without knowing anything about you. I let my personal biases cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I disrespected you in a way that was completely unacceptable." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent the past few weeks learning about who you are, your service, your sacrifices, and everything you've done for this community. The more I learned, the more ashamed I became. You didn't deserve what happened, and I take full responsibility for my actions. James studied Caleb for a long moment, his gaze steady. I appreciate you coming here to say that, he said finally. But an apology isn't just about words. It's about what you do moving forward. Caleb nodded, his chest tightening. I understand that, and I want you to know that I'm committed to making changes, not just at the restaurant, but in myself. I've already started taking steps to educate myself and to create an environment at the Willows table that truly is inclusive. I know it won't undo what I did, but I'm determined to do better. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Then James spoke, his voice softer but firm. We all make mistakes, Mr. Barnes. What matters is whether we learn from them. You've taken the first step by coming here and owning up to what you did. But it's a long road, and actions speak louder than words. Caleb swallowed hard, the sting of James's words tempered by the respect he felt for the man sitting across from him. Thank you, Mr. Porter. I promise I'll do everything I can to earn back the trust I've lost. James nodded, his expression softening slightly. I believe in forgiveness, Mr. Barnes, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means holding people accountable while giving them the chance to grow. I hope you'll use this experience to be better, not just for yourself, but for the people around you. Caleb felt a lump rise in his throat. He had expected anger or dismissal, but James's calm wisdom and willingness to forgive left him humbled. I will, Caleb said earnestly. Thank you for giving me this chance. As the conversation wound down, James stood and extended his hand. Caleb rose to shake it, the gesture feeling more significant than any handshake he'd ever experienced. Take care, Mr. Barnes, James said as he walked Caleb to the door. And remember, treating people with dignity isn't just a nice idea, it's a responsibility. Caleb nodded, his heart heavy yet strangely hopeful. As he stepped outside and walked back to his car, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a start, a chance to rebuild, not just his reputation, but his character. Driving away, Caleb glanced in the rearview mirror at the house fading into the distance. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. And for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to do just that. The weight that had been pressing on him since the incident now felt slightly lighter, replaced by a determination to make things right in every way he could. Caleb resolved not only to implement changes at the Willows table, but also to become a better leader and individual, setting a new standard for himself and those around him. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but as Caleb drove away from James Porter's house, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Despite Caleb's efforts to rebuild the Willows table, the damage to its reputation proved irreversible. The once bustling restaurant, a favorite gathering place for the community, now sat eerily quiet. Empty tables lined the dining room, the hum of conversation replaced by silence. Cancellations and declining foot traffic had pushed the business to the brink of collapse. Suppliers had begun pulling out, and Caleb struggled to meet financial obligations. As Caleb walked through the empty dining room one evening, he couldn't help but reflect on how things had spiraled so quickly. The backlash from the James Porter incident, compounded by the viral social media posts and former employees speaking out, had left a permanent stain on the restaurant's legacy. Despite issuing a public apology and taking steps to create a more inclusive environment, Caleb realized that rebuilding trust was far more difficult than he had anticipated. In the weeks following his apology to James, Caleb had thrown himself into making amends. He implemented new training programs for his staff, focusing on sensitivity and inclusion. He reached out to local veterans organizations, offering the restaurant as a venue for events and fundraisers. But these efforts, while well-intentioned, were not enough to undo the harm caused by the initial incident. Caleb understood that the restaurant's closure was inevitable. One by one, employees began to leave. Amanda, one of the last servers to remain, approached Caleb after her shift one night. I'm sorry, Caleb, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. I've found another job. I just can't stay here anymore. Caleb nodded, his heart sinking. He couldn't blame her or any of the others who had left. They had endured months of uncertainty and stress, and he knew they deserved better. The final blow came when the restaurant's landlord informed Caleb that the lease would not be renewed. With no financial cushion to fall back on, Caleb had no choice but to prepare for the Willows table to close its doors for good. He spent his final days at the restaurant packing up equipment, taking down decorations, and saying goodbye to the place that had been his pride and joy for so many years. Amid the closure, Caleb found himself grappling with deeper questions about his actions and the societal pressures that had shaped them. He began to examine the biases and assumptions that had led to his treatment of James Porter. In many ways, Caleb realized he had been a product of a culture that encouraged divisiveness and quick judgments. He thought back to his upbringing, where strong opinions were often celebrated, and disagreement was seen as a threat rather than an opportunity for understanding. These reflections were not easy. Caleb often found himself awake late at night, replaying the events of the past months in his mind. He wondered how things might have been different if he had acted with more empathy and less ego. It was a painful but necessary process, one that forced him to confront his own shortcomings. To better understand his biases, Caleb began attending community workshops and discussion groups focused on diversity and inclusion. He listened to stories from people of different backgrounds, absorbing their experiences and perspectives. These sessions were humbling, often bringing Caleb to tears as he realized the extent of his ignorance. Yet they also gave him hope. They reminded him that change was possible, even if it required unlearning years of ingrained behavior. One particularly impactful moment came during a veterans panel discussion at a local community center. A speaker shared his struggles with reintegration after returning from deployment, describing the isolation and misunderstanding he often faced. As Caleb listened, he felt a deeper connection to James Porter's experience. He began to see the incident at the Willows table not just as a personal failure, but as part of a broader issue of how society treats those who have served. Caleb's journey of growth also brought him closer to people he had once overlooked. He formed friendships with members of the local veterans community, many of whom were initially wary of him. Over time, they came to see his sincerity and commitment to change. Caleb volunteered at veterans events, often working quietly behind the scenes to set up chairs or serve food. These moments, though small, gave him a sense of purpose and connection. As Caleb navigated his personal transformation, he also began to reflect on the societal pressures that had influenced his actions. He recognized how easy it was to succumb to the fear of controversy, to make decisions based on avoiding discomfort rather than doing what was right. He thought about the role social media had played, both in amplifying the backlash and in exposing the flaws in his leadership. Caleb began to see social media not just as a platform for outrage, but as a tool for accountability and education. Through these experiences, Caleb started to rebuild his sense of identity. He was no longer just a restaurant owner or a manager trying to salvage his reputation. He was a man learning to be better, one step at a time. The journey was far from over, but Caleb embraced it with humility and determination. The closure of the Willows table was a bittersweet moment. On its final night, Caleb hosted a small gathering for the remaining staff and a few loyal patrons. He stood before them, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning of something new. I may have failed as a leader, but I've learned more in these past few months than I ever thought possible. And I'm going to keep learning, keep growing." As the last light in the restaurant flickered out, Caleb felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of the Willows table was no longer his to carry, but the lessons it had taught him would remain. He walked out into the night, ready to face whatever came next. As the dust settled on the closure of the Willows table, Caleb Barnes found himself navigating a new chapter of his life. While the restaurant was gone, the lessons it had imparted stayed with him, shaping his path forward. Each step of his journey had been painful, but it also illuminated the importance of humility, accountability, and growth. Before you go, let's reflect on what this story teaches us about second chances, redemption, and the ripple effects of our actions. Caleb's life after the restaurant became a testament to the power of transformation. Determined not to let his mistakes define him, he threw himself into volunteer work. He became a regular at local veterans centers, often working behind the scenes to help organize events and support those who had served. One memorable day, Caleb was invited to speak at a community event honoring local heroes. Though nervous, he shared his story candidly, admitting his failings and explaining the profound impact meeting James Porter had on his life. "I thought I was a leader," Caleb told the audience, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I didn't understand what leadership truly meant until I had to face my own flaws. Mr. Porter taught me that dignity, respect, and understanding are not just ideals, they're responsibilities we owe to each other." The speech resonated deeply with those in attendance, many of whom approached Caleb afterward to thank him for his honesty. Over time, Caleb's efforts began to mend some of the damage he had caused. While he could never fully undo the harm, he found solace in the small ways he could contribute to his community. Ethan Porter, who had initially viewed Caleb's attempts at redemption with skepticism, also came to see the sincerity of his efforts. The two developed a tentative but mutual respect, occasionally crossing paths at community events. Ethan even featured Caleb in one of his advocacy videos, highlighting the importance of accountability and growth. "It's not about perfection," Ethan said in the video. "It's about progress." Caleb's story shows that even when we fall short, we can still choose to rise and do better. For James Porter, the incident at the Willows table became a footnote in a life defined by resilience and service. While he continued to wear his MAGA hat with quiet pride, he also welcomed the changes Caleb had made, viewing them as proof that people could learn from their mistakes. When asked about the incident by a local reporter, James simply said, "What matters isn't the mistake, it's what you do afterward." Caleb made the choice to grow, and that's something I respect. As Caleb moved forward, he found new opportunities to channel his skills and experiences. He began consulting for small businesses, helping them navigate challenges and avoid the pitfalls he had once succumbed to. His workshops on leadership and inclusivity became popular, drawing from his own hard-earned lessons to guide others. The societal conversation sparked by the James Porter incident also left a lasting impact. Discussions about the treatment of veterans, the importance of respecting differing viewpoints, and the dangers of snap judgments became more prominent in the community. Local leaders worked to foster greater inclusivity, and Caleb's transformation served as a reminder that even deeply rooted biases could be unlearned. As we close this chapter, we're reminded of the enduring power of empathy and accountability. Caleb's story is not just one of redemption, but also a call to action for all of us. It challenges us to examine our own biases, to take responsibility for our actions, and to strive for growth, even when the road is difficult. What would you have done in Caleb Barnes's place? How do we balance accountability with forgiveness? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales of growth and resilience.